All right. Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and call the Subcommittee on General Government to order. Madam Secretary, can you please call the roll?
Assemblywoman Backus. Assemblywoman Brown May. Here. Assemblywoman Kasama. Here. Assemblyman Miller. Assemblyman O'Neill. Here. Senator Goycochea. Here. Senator Harris. Here. Assemblywoman Peters. Here. Chair Neal. Thank you.
I'm here. Mark, Assemblyman Miller present. All right, so everyone, we only have one agency's budget that we're going to discuss. We're going to go ahead and call the Department of Taxation to the table. Okay. Ready when you are.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Shelley Hughes, Executive Director for the Department of Taxation. Many of you have seen our presentation in the pre-session hearing, so I will just give you a quick high-level review of the department, and then I'll move quickly into our governor recommended budget. The department's mission is to provide fair, efficient, and effective administration of tax programs for the state of Nevada in accordance with applicable statutes, regulations, and policies. Our budget requests align with our mission and enable the department to address taxpayers' needs and expectations. The Department of Taxation is comprised of 6 divisions and serves as staff to 5 boards and commissions. The Nevada Tax Commission is the head of the department and one of the boards and commissions that is staffed by the department. The Nevada Tax Commission meets multiple times a year to hear appeals, review and hold public hearings on regulations, and pursue other such actions that are necessary for the operation of the Department of Taxation. As an overview of the department's operation, we perform a variety of functions, including administering 21 different tax types, including 3 fees, appraising property, establishing guidelines for local governments, and ensuring compliance with those guidelines. We review local government budgets, and we certify annual populations. Additionally, the department is one of the main revenue collecting agencies in the state, and we collect over 70% of the total unrestricted state general fund revenue. In addition to the state general fund, the department also distributes revenue to other sources, including the state education fund and local governments. For fiscal year 2022, we collected and distributed over $9.5 billion in state and local government revenue, and this is an increase of over $1.6 billion from fiscal year 2021. This slide demonstrates how much revenue we received in fiscal year 2022 from each tax type we administer. As you can see from this chart, of the $9.5 billion in revenue collected during fiscal year 2022, sales and use tax collections made up $6.6 billion, or 69.4% of the $9.5 billion collected. This slide also demonstrates our distributions for fiscal year 2022. The State General Fund receives 40% of our total distributions, or approximately $3.9 billion. Local governments receive 33.5%, or approximately $3.2 billion. And the State Education Fund gets 24.6%, or approximately $2.3 billion. The department has one budget account 2361. We receive the majority of our funding from the State General Fund. We have 2 enhancement requests. The first is Decision Unit E228. Decision Unit E228 funds hazardous waste materials, destruction, storage, and transportation. We are requesting funding in the amount of $374,536 in fiscal year '24 and $374,574 in fiscal year '25. These funds will cover one new premium fleet services monthly vehicle rental at approximately $5,200 each year. And this vehicle will transport product after seizure for delivery to the storage facility. The funds also cover rental of a secure temperature control storage warehouse from the Department of Administration to properly store the seized product until it can be destroyed. We have determined that we would need approximately 5,300 square feet of warehouse space. At $1.38 a square foot, this results in approximately $88,000 each year. The funds will also cover a contract with a proper licensed business for destruction of the product at approximately $251,000 each year. This includes transportation from the storage facility to destruction site. Our research reveals only 2 businesses in the western area that provide this type of service. One is Clean Harbors, which we currently use. We are requesting these funds because when Senate Bill 263 became effective in 2020, we didn't realize that we would have the amount of costs to transport, store, and destroy contraband vape product. EPA regulations require the destruction of acutely hazardous waste to be done using a properly permitted business and only at a properly permitted destruction site. This request would provide funding to help the department to fulfill our statutory requirements to seize and destroy contraband while complying with federal regulations. The second decision unit is E237. Decision Unit E237 funds Nevada Tax Commissioners' quarterly travel. The costs are $14,741 in fiscal year '24 and the same amount in fiscal year '25. These costs cover travel for 8 Nevada tax commissioners to travel quarterly between Las Vegas and Reno for in-person tax commission meetings. Costs include per diem, fleet services rental, mileage, and airfare as applicable. Pre-COVID, our commissioners had in-person meetings and traveled to attend these meetings. However, during the pandemic, the Nevada Tax Commission was meeting virtually, which didn't require travel, thus these funds were eliminated from our budget. Now, with many pandemic restrictions being lifted, the Nevada Tax Commissioners desire to return to in-person meetings at least quarterly to better assess witness credibility, evaluate hearing evidence, deliberate with colleagues, and render important decisions. This completes our governor-recommended budget items. We do have 11 one-shot appropriation requests for an approximate total amount of $3.8 million. We understand that one-shot appropriations will be heard separately in budget bills, so I'll not go into detail on each one unless the chair would like me to do so.
No, I'm probably not going to ask about it because I understand, like, the uninterruptible power supply. I understood that one. So members, I know you guys have questions, but I'm going to start off questions with Assemblyman Miller.
Good morning. Thank you all. My first question is, how do I find this room? But that mission ended up being successful. So my question here, thank you all for the presentation this morning. My question here is about the replacement of the unified tax system, that project, the timeline. Can you kind of provide like a status update, timeline, projected, where we are in that process?
Madam Chair, through you to Assemblyman Miller, Shelley Hughes for the record. I do have my Project Mint team here. If you have several questions, I can bring them up to the table.
Yes, go ahead.
Jason Giesler, Department of Taxation, for the record, through you, Chair Neal, to Assemblyman Miller. The timeline of the project is considered on time. The feasibility study was conducted for the department several years ago during the height of the COVID pandemic. It was developed on some assumptions and some parameters that were unknown at that time in terms of when it would roll out, how it would roll out, et cetera. It's been done sort of on a working document of estimations of time periods and costs. There was a delay in the hiring process in March of '22, due to staffing issues with state vacancies, et cetera, finding qualified personnel to assist us on the project, which pushed us back to the RFP stages and onboarding like another quarter. So really, we've been in sort of this ramp-up period now. Expected to release the RFP sometime in March is our current goal. We would have vendor onboarding and contract negotiations and all of that done, and hopefully a vendor onboarded towards December of '23 is the current projection.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So we're expecting the project, we're expecting the vendor to come on board at December of 2023 or completed with the project. I'm sorry, I might have misunderstood what you said there.
Chair, through you to Assemblyman Miller. The project right now is broken into 3 distinct phases, which implementation would occur. Phase 1 is going to be a set of tax types. Phase 2 is going to be another set of tax types, and Phase 3 will be ultimately the final set of tax types. That is how it's projected to us right now. We have a contract with Gartner, who has provided a kind of a timeline of us as expectations of what we should expect that to be. When the vendor comes on board, the vendor might have a slightly different approach in terms of their timeline to that. They might want to implement it over 3.5 years, et cetera. Each implementation period might be 14 months, 16 months. It's unknown at this time. Project implementation is scheduled to start kind of ramping up, hopefully sometime in December after vendors onboarded, contract negotiations, and that sort of happens. That would be phase 1. So phase 1 in arguably 24, 25, 26, and then a portion into 27, depending upon how the dates shake. The original ROM assumption assumed that implementation periods would fall right in line with fiscal years, right? So July 1 you would start, and June 30th you would be done. And July 1 you would start again on phase 2, June 30th you would be done. That's not really practical. It was just for an assumption period of designing the document and the assumptions. When we get into there, we'll figure out how that timeline crosses dual fiscal years.
So essentially, we're bringing on, the goal is to bring on the vendor. We're doing the RFP March. We plan to have the vendor in place by December, but we're still not sure exactly or have a good window of time of how long this project will actually take to get completed, is what I understand.
Chair Neal, through you to Assemblyman Miller, I think we do. I think the department does have a good idea of implementation. I do think that a 3-year timeline is very reasonable given the assumptions that we've heard through other states that have implemented similar modernization projects. We will know more certainly when the vendor is onboarded and they provide their timeline. They're the experts in it, and they come in and do that for various state agencies across the country. So. It could change slightly, yeah, but we are anticipating contract negotiations, vendor onboarding, demonstrations, the RFP process, the evaluation committee, all of that, to hopefully be wrapped up by December 2023.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Harris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Forgive my ignorance here, but I'm wondering why we need to fly 8 commissioners up to Reno for 15K each biennium as opposed to having them stay in Las Vegas where they live and maybe video conferencing. Is there some statutory requirement that they fly back and forth across the country or across the state?
Madam Chair, through you to Senator Harris, Shelley Hughes for the record. These costs are determined by, there are certain commissioners that live in Las Vegas and certain that live in Reno. And so if they're not all 8 commissioners will fly each time. The schedule was for 2 meetings in Las Vegas, in-person meetings in Las Vegas, and 2 in-person meetings in Reno. But we do have the capability of video conferencing the commissioners back and forth between the commission meetings. So we plan on doing that in between the quarterly meetings.
Understood. So this doesn't necessarily cover every meeting that the commission will have. It's just a concerted effort to have at least 4 meetings where all commissioners are in the same space.
Shelley Hughes for the record, yes, that is correct.
Okay, thanks so much.
Assemblywoman Kasama.
Thank you, Chair. Back to the implementation of the new system for taxation. I was just concerned, I'm sure you're all dealing with that, but, you know, since part of this is funded with the ARPA funds, and it has to be, you know, obligated by 24, and then it all has to be spent by the end of December 26. So I'm just concerned that that is really reinforced in the RFP and that the people you choose can deliver on that, because it just seems like it'd be a mess if we don't meet that. And I'm just concerned that these timelines are met when we've had such a delay already. And I understand staffing issues and that, but.
Chair Neal, through you to Assemblywoman Kasama. Jason Giesler, Department of Taxation, for the record. Yes, we are monitoring that as well. And in our ROM document, which is rough order of magnitude assumptions, we are calculating that. We actually have specific timings marked for those ARPA dollars to be used. It is our anticipation that we would use ARPA dollars for the first 2 years of the implementation of the project, and that for implementation year 3 onto the maintenance of the project, that would be a subsequent budget request in the next biennium.
Thank you.
So I might add, in terms of the deliverables on that, to answer your question, the RFP that we are designing is marked with specific deliverables so that we can task those items and ensure that the vendor is meeting those benchmarks so that we can appropriately use those
So
dollars.
you'll front load the ARPA funds. We're a ship that moves very slowly.
Yes.
And we're already moving slowly on this, and so just making sure as much as possible we're diligent so that we, use the funding that we have wisely already. Thank you.
Assemblywoman Peters.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have similar concerns. We've seen several of these projects just get extended and extended over time, and particularly because of the funding source for this project, wanting to make sure it's really managed properly and correctly. So my question has to do with the way this is presented in your budget. During our October IFC meeting, we asked that this come in specific line items in your budget, and it seems to be placed in a reserve until something happens, in which you'll come back to IFC and we'll address it then, but that's not what we asked for in October. So can you just talk a little bit about why you submitted this request this way rather than through the process that was requested in October?
The department would like to phone a friend.
I have a follow-up question, if I may. That doesn't have to do particularly with that part. Well, yes. Can we, if you are ready, we can, okay.
Okay, through the chair to, or no, you are also the chair, right? No, sorry. Sorry about that. Okay, through Chair Neal to Assemblywoman Peters. Joy Grimmer for the record, Department of Taxation. So through discussions with the Governor's Finance Office, when we took this to IFC in October, you may recall that we said that we thought we could drop the RFP by a December, January timeline. So when we did that timeline, we didn't know if perhaps we may have a vendor selected prior to the end of fiscal year 23. Now, the RFP, we're trying to be very thorough, make sure that we have everything in there to hold the vendor accountable, and we don't foresee using the money in fiscal year 23. So it is setting in a reserve right now. It would balance forward into the next fiscal year, requiring us to come back to IFC though. So at this point, we're looking at an April or a June IFC, but likely an April IFC so we can make sure we're in front of you and discuss our transfer from the reserve to the expenditure categories sooner rather than later.
Follow-up, Chair. So I have to go back to that. That's not what we had asked for in October. And I understand that it's not something that's being used in this particular biennium. Even in the first 6 months of the biennium, right, that we're not anticipating using these dollars. Although I imagine your office needs the administrative dollars to manage the onboarding of the contractors. Maybe I'm incorrect in that, but my request would be that you work with our fiscal staff on trying to get this under some particular authority during this biennium, and see if we can do that with the assumptions you have in hand so that we can meet that obligation from October, but also ensure that we are meeting that 2026 deadline and have this in a holding pattern that enables you to keep moving forward rather than having to come back to IFC and request an additional authority at that point. So I'll have fiscal staff reach out and we can work together on that piece. I have another question, if I may, Madam Chair. Thank you. Regarding your vendor selection process. So you have been working with, I assume, a current vendor or somebody who you've been referred to. Gartner is their name. Tell us a little bit about your vendor selection process and how this partnership with Gartner in determining kind of your assumptions in the RFP and feasibility study are working together.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you and to you, Assemblywoman Peters. Part of our process with working with Gartner is we brought them on, was it 2019, to do a feasibility study to see where the Department of Taxation was at, to look at and help us assess if we were in a readiness state to bring this on. COVID hit, everything got pushed back. When we started ramping back up for this project, we brought Gartner back in to help us actually write the RFP. So they're here now, working with us, working with me. I'm sorry, Patrick Starr, for the record. I'm the Enterprise Project Manager for the Department of Taxation. I work directly with Gartner in order to ensure that RFP is getting written in the manner that would benefit the state. They are, once we release the RFP, they're going to help us with our evaluation and what our scoring mechanism is going to be for the vendor selection process. And then when we get into the actual evaluation, we'll score, do what's right for the state, bring on the best vendor possible for us, and then go into that implementation phase and onboard that vendor. So the Gartner process will end with the RFP and the releasing of that RFP.
I have one more follow-up on this issue. So is Gartner someone who would submit an application under that RFP, a proposal?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you to you, Assemblywoman Peters. Gartner is simply just on board to write and help us get an RFP that's releasable. That selection process and everything is on us as far as the department to make the proper selection through the state purchasing procedures. I guess to understand, clarify the question here, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so do you anticipate that Gartner will submit a proposal under the RFP to provide these this additional next step phase service?
I'm sorry, and thank you, Madam Chair, through you to Assemblywoman Peters. Patrick Starr, for the record. They will not be bidding on anything there, I'm sorry. They're just simply on board for the RFP process to help us to actually write that document, and then they will exit and the new vendor will come on board.
Thank you for clarifying. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Members, any additional questions? So, Assemblywoman Castaldo.
Mine has to do with the one-time appropriations. Is this a good time or?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So my question is, when I look at the one-time general fund appropriations, there is 1.4 million for the Carson City office relocation. And could you just give a little overview of that?
Madam Chair, through you to Assemblywoman Kasama, Shelley Hughes for the record. So we determined costs by obtaining quotes from vendors as we could. We did some online research, and we looked at previous moves.
I meant more the timeline, like where are you moving to, or I'm sure the costs have been calculated correctly, just.
Sorry, I apologize. Shelley Hughes for the record. So do we have a timeline? We really don't have a timeline. We're hoping sooner rather than later. Our current lease expires November 2023. The one shot anticipates a move date by December 1st.
So wasn't there intent to be building, a building here in Carson City to house state agencies? And if that's the case, and if the thought is that the Department of Taxation would move into that, isn't this request too early?
Madam Chair, through you to Assemblywoman Kasama. When we put in our budget request, we weren't aware that there was going to be new buildings.
No, I'm not sure. I'm just
Yeah,
asking, because I know
we weren't aware of the new buildings, yes, so. But it would be nice to move into a new building.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure. I just know I've seen in the budgets, I can't remember exactly where, that there's, talk of multiple agencies in Carson City. And so I would go back to my original thought that wouldn't this be too early then? Because if something like that happens, then wouldn't it be more the thought of extending the lease for a few months if needed to move into a new facility? So then shouldn't this not be in here at this time?
Madam Chair, through you to Assemblywoman Kasama, Shelley Hughes for the record. I would say yes, if we were going to consider moving into the new building, then we would have to continue to lease from the new property.
So is that something you could clarify as far as timing and whether this would be needed now? And we could save the state money during this current?
Madam Chair, through you to Assemblywoman Kasama, Shelley Hughes for the record. I guess we would have to see what these new buildings, the size, the space limitations, if they could house the department's employees. We would have to do a little bit of research into what these new buildings' capacity would be. And then we could probably reevaluate this budget request item.
Yeah, I would request that we look at that, because a coordination, it seems to me, amongst many of the agencies here would need to be done to see what would be appropriate and when the money should be requested. So I would request that if you could get back with that information, I think that'd be helpful. And really, it isn't just your agency, it's the other ones too. It's an overall plan. Thank you.
Thank you. So, you have a question? So I have two questions going back to the unified tax system. So I want to talk about the governor's recommended budget allocation. So on the governor's recommendation, he has the 42 million roughly in '24, and then it's another 42 million in '25. But IFC only approved the 42 million of the ARPA funds, but it looks like it's double in the governor's rec? Or can you explain each year having that dollar amount and no reduction?
Senator Neal, to answer your question, Jason Giesler for the Department of Taxation. That is not correct. So implementation is projected at this point in time, according to the ROM, to cost approximately $64 million, which is spread out over the course of those 3 years. So in the original IFC request in October, the ARPA request was for $42 million. Due to the pivot in timing of the release date of the RFP, that number is going to be reduced at the next IFC where we go to actually request the funds by $3.5 million. To account for that first quarter onboarding now happening in December rather than October, December timeframe rather than on July 1, right? Which would go into fiscal year 27. So arguably, you could assume that fiscal year 24 will be approximately $18 million. Fiscal year 25 will be approximately $21 million. Fiscal year 26, another $21 million. And then 27 will be a combination of that $3.5 million plus maintenance as the system is onboarded, right, and continuing on through its normal life cycle. Implementation period, though, $64 million roughly at this point in time to implement the system.
So that leads me to my next question, and I'm going to come back to that 64 million. How much are you paying Gartner to onboard? Like, what is that total cost that you have paid already or anticipate to pay them up to the RFP launch?
Senator Neal, to you, Jason Giesler, for the record, Department of Taxation. The RFP process to establish, get us ready, do the follow-up for that, and actually draft the RFP through Gartner was divided in several distinct phases. There was a $30,000 or so kind of assessment need. So after COVID, right, Gartner came back in and reassessed the needs and the understandings of the department to make sure that things hadn't changed, things were correct in terms of the assumptions that were being made by Gartner. To write and draft the RFP, it's $125,000 for Gartner to do that process with us. And I think to the committee's point of these modernization projects, they're very involved, they're very deep. The RFPs that we're looking at in comparison to other states around the nation, with attachments and whatever, there's several hundred pages and very detailed, specific information. And so we want to make sure that we are crossing those T's, dotting those I's. And so our work with Gartner is really very intense, making sure that we're doing that. So that process is $124,000. And then whether we continue on with helping them develop some additional criteria for us to help evaluate the vendors that do ultimately propose solutions for this system could be an additional $74,000. The total contract cost for Gartner at this point in time is $263,800 for fiscal year 23.
But you're anticipating still using them through part of 24, correct? Or is it just 23?
It is just 23. So when Gartner completes the RFP and that process drops, their work will be completed by June 30th.
Okay.
And our contract will be expired by June 30th.
And so it's $124,000 to write an RFP. That looks like a second business for somebody. Because I'm super curious, only because state RFPs, it's not the first RFP that's been done, right? And it's not the first global system that we've ever encountered. And so why is it, I don't know what the average cost is for an RFP, but $124K, and then you're like, well, it's a couple of hundred pages or it's 100 pages, and that would make it like, what, $1,000 a page? But I'm just super curious about how this is different than other, I guess, agencies, and could we have emulated another RFP in terms of like certain pages that we need to probably examine and look at? Because when I, back in 2019, I think, the stuff that EATS does, the thing we went through with DMV, like there's been just some saga, unified systems that we've gone through. So can you just break that down a little bit more?
Yes, absolutely. Jason Giesler, for the record, through you, Chair Neal. Yeah, I mean, those are very good points, and the state does have a purchasing department that specializes in procurement, that does our procurement for us. I do think it's important to say with the scope and depth of these type of projects, these are a little different than, your mom and pop contracts for whatever it may be. I mean, these are hundreds of millions of dollars, and I think the safeguards that having a vendor come in and do these things that has expertise in these areas and arenas is worth every dollar spent. It allows the state to sort of act as cheap insurance for failed modernization attempts in the future. And nothing that you're saying is not lost on us, right, in terms of other agencies that have come before us or become before this body and had failed modernization efforts or have had issues. We are not the only state agency that uses Gartner. Gartner is a good of the state contract, and several other agencies have used them through RFP or through whatever consulting services that they offer. But yeah, I do see the value in there beyond state purchasing in sort of that upper tier specific niche that they're in.
And thank you for that. And so now I want to travel back to the 64 million. I know they're helping you get a vendor. You're hoping to get a vendor. Ideally, I'm believing that you probably have a couple of vendors. They're out there. It's not like we're just, are they, because it's my understanding you're still going to try to do an off the shelf. Okay? So that means that there's a range of people or products that you can actually look at. So how are you going to make sure that it remains within the 64 million? And you don't have to come back, because a portion of that is the maintenance on the back end. But really, we don't want you to come back to IFC as a work program. I think that was kind of, if it wasn't made clear, let me make that clear. We also don't want you to come back and say, well, it turned out that there's another 10 million that we're going to need. So how are you going to make sure, minus the maintenance at the end, that whatever vendor you choose stays within a range that makes sense so you do not have to come back for money?
Jason Giesler, Department of Taxation, for the record, through your chair, Neil. That is exactly what we intend to do, is to, again, the ROM right now is merely an estimation of time and an estimation of rough dollars that we are assuming based upon Gartner's expertise in this area and their knowledge. When the RFP comes back and we do have vendor selection, to your point, there are a handful of vendors that specialize in this area that are working across the country, implementing their own modernization projects at other Department of Revenues and Department of Taxations. We anticipate who those vendors will be in terms of, we have an idea of who will respond to the RFP. There will be several respondents, most likely, to this. And once we get that number and once we start realizing what those dollars are going to be in terms of contract negotiations, it will put us in a better position to be able to adjust our ROM at that point and to make some final assumptions. To your point, in terms of asking for more dollars, it is certainly not the department's intention to come before IFC more than the department would have to. So we would want to make sure that the specific deliverables are called out within the contract that have specific dates and times, specific cost amounts, and that we can hold the vendor accountable for that. So to Assemblywoman Kasama's point, we can make sure that we use the ARPA dollars to the best of our ability as we go forward.
And I'll just say this as a closing remark, and then I'll see if any members have final questions. Assemblywoman Peters stated it earlier, but it's very important that either a budget amendment come forward, right, or that you work with fiscal in order to create this as an expenditure that is not set in a reserve, so that, number one, it's allocated, right? It shows that it's allocated under the ARPA requirements and that there is some control over the money. And so it's not going to be sitting out there as something that can be, I guess, reverted or an agency, executive agency can change their mind and say, well, we decided we want to use that 42 million for something else. And then next thing you know, we're in a situation. And so I just wanted to put that out there. And so hopefully, I don't know if the GFO is having a conversation about a budget amendment, but it would probably be a wise move before we get any further to say, hey, might need to just secure this immediately. So with that, members, do you have any additional comments? If not, you guys are free. All right. So okay, so we will go ahead and see if anyone is here for public comment. BPS, is there anyone on the phone for public comment?
Thank you, Chair. The public line is open and working. However, there are no callers at this time.
All right, so the Subcommittee of General Gov is adjourned. Thank you, members.